Welcome, if everybody could have a seat, welcome to Big Cities, Big Data, how smart cities improve lives and save money. So my name is Sean Arian, and what I do is, you guys were probably expecting to see City Controller Ron Galperin sitting in the seat. He actually caught the flu last night, so I am a last-minute stand-in for Ron. Consider this your public service announcement, get a flu shot. I run an organization called the Bixel Exchange, and what the Bixel Exchange is, we're a civic tech organization based at the LA Area Chamber of Commerce. What we do is we bring the technology community to the table around important civic issues in Los Angeles, particularly around education, workforce development, and entrepreneurship. What I want to do, though, is talk a little bit. Today we want to explore a little bit about how cities use technology and data to achieve social good. And I think in the last 5 to 10 years, you started to see an explosion of cities and civic organizations that are using data and technology to explore issues around equity, civic participation, and efficiency in the delivery of city services. And if you ask yourself, well, why are cities important? Well, state and federal government are pretty far away from most people's everyday lives. I know some of us wish it were a little further away sometimes than it actually is. But cities actually impact everything you do and everything you do every day. This is your garbage collection to public safety, roads, traffic, determining whether you can build a little add-on on the back of your house, the transportation system. Things that you do in your everyday life are impacted by what the decisions that cities make. So whether they're delivering those services efficiently, cost effectively, is important for how we all live our lives every day. You can see even here in the Southern California area, many cities have started tackling this issue. Everything from the person who is supposed to be sitting in this seat, our controller, who basically is put online with your smartphone. You can go on and pretty much analyze any financial data from the city of Los Angeles through their open data portal now. You also have people like Lilian, who in her role as a chief data officer for the city of Los Angeles, opened up over 1,100 data sets and APIs for the city of LA. You also have innovators like the city of Long Beach, where Mayor Garcia did a great job of creating an innovation team, 4 or 5 years ago? And really starting to drive Long Beach, or even our neighboring city here, Santa Monica, where they have their well-being index funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies to really look at how do they use data to track the well-being of the citizens of Santa Monica. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. You can go onto the app to see all of their backgrounds, but I think many of them you're probably going to know. First is Honorable Robert Garcia, Mayor of Long Beach. We have Steve Schwartz, a partner at McKinsey & Company. Lilian Corral, who's now the Director of National Strategy for the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. Stephen Engblom, the Senior Vice President for Global Cities for AECOM. And Rohit Gupta, who's a Managing Director of Bixel Ventures. So with that, I'm going to jump into the first question for Mayor Garcia. Mayor, since you've taken office, you've really propelled Long Beach forward in issues around technology and data, from the innovation team that you've set up to the BizPort portal that's won national awards, to some of the issues that you've been working on, pioneering issues around sustainable transportation. Could you talk a little bit about how Long Beach is using technology to benefit the lives of its residents?
Sure. Good to be here. Hello, everybody. I'll just say, I think for me, I was elected about 3 years ago, and it was a very easy transition because I would consider myself an active user of technology. And so I think, obviously, when I became mayor and came into office, my expectation level of how the city should operate and how easily it should kind of integrate with the technology I was already using didn't really match up. And so it was always very important for me to ensure that that Long Beach kind of grew up and really was a 21st century city. Being a city of 500,000 people and a pretty large community, we needed to really step up. And so we got active really quick. We tried to learn from some of our partner cities that were already doing really great work, like Boston and Denver and other places across the country. And LA was also doing some pretty exciting things as well. And so first things what we did is we restructured our entire technology department. So that was the very first thing I did is we created a new Department of Technology and Innovation. We created a Citizens Commission focused around innovation. We immediately reached out to Mike Bloomberg, who is doing all this work around innovative cities. And we're fortunate to land in that first year a pretty significant grant from Bloomberg Philanthropies to start an innovation team, which we put together, made up of some designers, a social scientist, really great engineers and other folks that really allowed us to look at our city systems more effectively. And so I think the most important thing for cities is to kind of take that first step and evaluate what you don't have and what you're not doing. Mm-hmm. And I believe in Long Beach, we've completely had a complete culture change in the way we view technology. We've brought in younger people. We've ensured that everyone understands that regardless of the department, whether it's public works or whether it's transit, that technology and innovation can make, and collection of data can make those departments more efficient. And we've done some really, I think, great, simple things by collecting data that are allowing us to make better decisions. And I'll just give you the one example. We're now, for the first time, looking at, through the police department and through part of our Bloomberg work, folks that are high users of our jail and our public safety system. So, we're looking at every arrest we make, and we're looking at who we're actually arresting and why we're arresting them. And the immediate thing that we found, which sounds like it makes sense, is that it's really a small number of people that are committing a vast majority of our crimes. And so we have essentially a small subset of folks that are using a vast majority of our resources, because in almost every city, public safety is usually 45, 50, 55% of your budget. And it is really a fraction of folks in your community that are costing that. So what can we do to change that behavior? And I think that's one example. We're doing some good work around there. And so I'm excited that Long Beach, I think now, is one of the cities leading the way in the country when it comes to technology and innovation.
Yeah, one of the few that is constantly up there whenever you're seeing cities getting awards. I'd like to delve a little bit more deeply into how do we use data to improve city services. So Steve, I wanted to ask you a question. You've done a lot of work in the past on how cities can better use data on issues around mobility, around waste, and even issues around how the city can do work around finance to actually make that happen. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about some innovative ways that you've seen cities do that and what you think they might be doing in the future?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways we're seeing, there was a report, we were just chatting about it before the panel started, that came out in the last couple of weeks that looked at where the users of ride sharing are sourcing demand from, and we were saying, there's a half full and a half empty, take on the report, because one of the big sources of demand for ride sharing is actually public transit, right? Mm-hmm. And you can say like, we're deleveraging public transit, right? Or you can start to say, wow, there's a competitive service out there that, just like an airport has origin and destination pairs, and you understand the demand on a certain route at a certain time on a certain day of the week, right? And you match the infrastructure and the equipment to that demand. You're actually, instead of setting an infrastructure and a route and then just sort of, tracking, who shows up on every 15-minute interval, you're actually have the ability now to get real data on real people and their real consumption of the service, right? And you can start to think about, wow, maybe I make adjustment to my light rail, I make adjustment to my bus, or maybe Helsinki, which I know is not in California. But
trying to promote our state here.
Yeah, but maybe we could annex that. But they partnered with a van-based ride-sharing program and started actually making bookable and appable with an app interface to actually supplement the public transit system right through the with a schedulable on-demand an Uber. Right?
So if you had a piece of advice for LA Metro, what would it be?
Not to touch that question.
Hopefully they're not a client.
Closer to my house. The station closer to my house. So that's one, right, on data. The second bit is, there's all, this is your, the same point that Mayor Garcia just made about who's actually consuming services, right? We've done some work with a garbage collection client at McKinsey, right? And you're now getting the ability to real-time weigh the bin, to geolocate where that happens, to actually run the analytics on the garbage bin versus the recycling bin versus the organic, the yard waste bin. And there's a lot of what's called pay-as-you-throw schemes, right? That you pay more the more garbage you generate. But it's all bin-based, right? And so we're actually going to potentially to another level where you can start paying by weight or volume. Not just, hey, do I get the big bin or the small bin? Do I have 2 recycling bins and 1 regular garbage bin? But to say how much was actually in there, and actually start to pay based on the demand or the service that you're actually consuming, which lets big households and small households maybe start to
Very interesting.
spread the costs. So there's 2.
Excellent. I'm going to follow up with that a little bit with you, Lilian. So you, until about September, were Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles. So Mayor Eric Garcetti brought you in to essentially look at issues like the ones that Steve is talking about of where can we do a better job of leveraging data to help the city deliver its services more efficiently. So how did LA approach open data and social equity, and what worked and what didn't work?
That's a great question.
And I may follow up on the what didn't work.
Yeah. So our approach in Los Angeles, I'm very proud of, because I think what we really took a look at it really as sort of the digital transformation of this very large institution. And I think it's not unsimilar to what any kind of big company has to do. And so I always remark on how important it was that we had a very top-down, bottoms-up approach, right? We had a great leader in Mayor Garcetti who is really promoting the use of data and technology across the leadership of his departments. We've also got great leaders like Ron Galperin across the city who were all promoting the same vision as well. So we've got this great leadership approach, and then what my team and I really focused on was then now how do we build the bottoms up? How do we work with city staff and then that network of data stewards across the city who are the people who on the day-to-day are picking up the trash bins and are really going to have to be the ones who adopt data and technology in order to kind of build the transformations that we're all seeking from government. So to me, that was a critical part of the recipe that makes Los Angeles special. And I think the way that we looked at open data, it's not just about opening up access to that data, but what's really critical is ensuring that when you're releasing that data, that it's accessible not just to data scientists, but to the consumer. So we did a very innovative approach in Los Angeles to cleaning LA's streets. And the key there is the government, the Department of Sanitation has to use data to grade every single street, come up with an index, and deploy resources based on need so we can get greater equity across the city. But even if we did all that, public perception is what's really critical. And if a citizen doesn't feel like their street is clean or doesn't know how their street compares to others, then it doesn't really matter how much resources we throw at the issue, right? So all we did is we just made that data accessible, but not in a spreadsheet so that just the data, the data geeks like myself could get it, but we actually made it mappable. So you could actually go in there and put your address, look at your street score, see how it compares to others, and look at how your community really rates, get involved, actually engage. So there's a piece to opening up, to making data open that's really not just about accessibility, but also about how you design applications and tools that allow citizens to access that information in a way that they can engage. And then I think in terms of what worked, I'll be quick. One thing for us to keep in mind is I feel like the transformation that government needs to make, and my background is actually in policy, not so much in data and technology, and I veered into it when I saw the potential there to really transform systems. The transformation has to happen from within. We can bring in a lot of really smart thinkers and apply a lot of new thinking to the process, but until we actually start to invest in, for example, in LA, the 30,000 city employees that are working in the city every day, and really think about that organizational change, until we do that, I think it's going to be very different for government to truly leverage all the little tools and investments we're making every single day. It doesn't have to be, I feel like the silver bullet, this like huge hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in technology to make us modern. We're making those investments every day, and if we invest in the people that are using those systems every day, then I think eventually we will actually see more strides in a lot of the ways that the services are designed and engineered.
Great. Stephen, I want to follow up on a point that Lilian just made with you. I know that AECOM has been sort of on the forefront of thinking about infrastructure, sustainability, and technology, and sort of the intersection between those, and is working with a lot of cities to look at how they use their data. So I guess the question I have for you is, one is this an issue of that we need more data out there, or is it that we just that cities need to figure out to better use the data that they have today? And if so, how should they use that data to build better cities?
Well, it's a great, I'm really enjoying the arc of this conversation because it is interesting as a company that's involved with cities and designing, building, financing, and operating these different systems. I think it's important to put it in the context of why are we talking about data, and why is infrastructure so important to cities? Because the infrastructure is the framework for accommodating population growth and economic development. And those, and also I think it's a really fascinating time in our industry. I think for in the 20th century, we really thought about making cities in a very different way. It was sort of very expert-driven, silo-driven. We wanted to make the fastest highways or the most direct rail lines or the most efficient port, but at the cost of really remembering that we're doing this in the service of people's lives. And what I really have been amazed at in our industry over the past decade has been the focus on some externalities, like the real focus around resiliency that has brought these experts from different departments around the table to talk about topics in the round. And I think that's the big context for answering your question about is there enough data. I think there is plenty of data. Each of the departments has enough data. What's really missing is having I would say a good way to think about this is that if from the sort of Lilian's point about a strong leader, I think a lot of cities have also spent the past decade producing some very strong visionary reports. I love the focus on equity that you brought up. Mm-hmm. Sort of the Plan LA has been a great framework for getting different departments in the city of Los Angeles to come around topics and to address them in new and innovative ways. And I think that, so my answer to the question is there's plenty of data, but cities just have to start using it, mm-hmm. for one thing, and then start collaborating and cooperating across agencies, and also across to innovative new solutions with the private sector, which has been doing a better job of utilizing the data, and that's why we've seen so much amazing innovation over the past decade. And so I think that I like to think of the analogy of like a play. So we've just lived through sort of like Act 2 when the private sector started showing up with all these unexpected data-driven solutions, and now we need to go into the next act where we start saying, okay, so that was pretty cool. How can we start doing these things together?
And I'm going to ask for a moment. I'm going to ask Lilian and Mayor Garcia to plug their ears. But is there anybody that's doing a particularly good job in California? Any cities?
Well, with respect, they've already talked about what amazing jobs both Long Beach and Los Angeles are already doing.
So in addition to LA and
so in addition to LA, I would I can just speak some of my own experience in Chicago. We've been doing a lot of really amazing work around flooding, which is their big issue. If you think about flooding traditionally, so using my sort of framework that I just talked about. In the 20th century, you would have piped and pumped your way out of the flooding issue. But that's not smart because if you think about the impacts of the city of Chicago has a tremendous amount of basement flooding and street flooding, which causes incredible public health problems. And by having all of the agencies come around and talk about how can the city be smarter about planning, procuring, utilizing existing resources like budgets and comparing timelines between agencies, really significant changes have occurred in a very short period of time because they've come around a topic like flooding. So.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I wanted to follow up, again, taking your analogy of a play where we're heading into Act 2. So if Act 1 is that cities are getting all of this data, they're putting it out there, and Act 2 is bringing the private sector or innovative companies to the table to work with them. I actually want to turn to you, Rohit, to ask, because this is exactly what you invest in, right? I read your website.
Yeah.
I looked at your bio. It basically said you're there to disrupt legacy industries like healthcare and government, being a legacy industry. So tell me a little bit, like, okay, in Act 2 of Stephen's play, like what is it that the companies that you're funding are going to do to disrupt government?
Right, that's a great question, and kind of agreeing with everyone that's here and what we've already heard is that the data's out there. You know, for the most part, we're not saying go out and deploy hundreds of thousands of sensors. Like Lilian said, it's not a hardware problem. And to give you a couple examples, one company we invested in, Valor Water Analytics, super smart founder. She figured out that, you know, your home has a smart water meter on it, and the utility pays for that, and there's a hardware company involved, and that really, the data that utility's interested in is how much water you collect. The hardware company can produce reams of information, and the only thing the utility wants is, did you use water this month? Crazy. It absolutely makes no sense. And so she figured out, hey, I can go in there, I can get all this information that they're not using, and then I can put some analytics on it and sell it back to the utility, right? So there's so much information that you can get from this, but the utilities, A, they're not asking for it, maybe they don't know they can do it, and B, the hardware companies aren't selling it to them. And so there's a market for existing, just accessible data. It's just there. It's just a matter of someone signing that contract saying, oh, we want this service, right? And this becomes very easily, like it bleeds into like all sorts of issues. So for example, she can figure out, is somebody in danger of losing their water? It's a big question, right? And in neighborhoods and communities where money or economic issues force people to lose their water, they can then intervene, right? And so people don't lose their water service. That's huge for human health and standards, right? Or utilities, somewhere between 2 to 7% of their revenue is just uncollected. They don't know who's not paying their bill. Absurd. And this is like a national number, like 2 to 7%. And she can just go in there and say, oh yeah, so-and-so not paying their bill, right? It's just simple interventions that should exist off the existing data we have, but no one's really built it yet. So this is a really exciting time to kind of get in that space. Another example, so we talk about Valor Water, it's simple siloed data, right? And you get into what the mayor's worked on, what Lilian's worked on. It is city agencies, it is other key stakeholders, NGOs, nonprofits. All these people have data. And how do you combine it, right? Like for me, getting 2 spreadsheets to work is tough, you know?
Yeah.
But these people have like so much information and it's siloed and there's governance and, I'm a healthcare provider, but the emergency services people need to look at my data. How do you do the governance there? There are certain things they can and can't or shouldn't be able to see. And so we're really interested in increasing data liquidity, breaking these silos, adding governance to data, and just making it accessible where people need to see it. And I think that goes a long way towards solving the problems in terms of data accessibility and using and maximizing what we have. Now the next step, what we're in Bixel Ventures really interested in is, okay, if we set that up, right, we can create a living lab, and this has already been done, right, here in Los Angeles. The Milken Institute's involved with USC at Keck Medical Center, Keck Medical School, and just, let's create a living lab where we can just start plugging startups, plugging founders with ideas in. And so they created a digital health lab at USC. Interesting stuff, and the startups that are coming out, they're building amazing products, hardware, software, analytics, whatever you want. If you have the data, there's somebody out there that can solve that problem. And it's just a matter of making it liquid and giving them some sort of access to government, right? If you're a startup, let's say, you're somewhere in your early 20s, maybe early 30s, somewhere in that range, and you have to go through a city budgeting process to get approval and get some money for a pilot, these kids, like, they have trouble paying their bills, you know? And to expect them to like survive that sort of like 9 to 12 to 15 months to get in a city's budget is really, might be asking a little too much. And so there comes a time when you start working with the government, you say, hey, you know what, we would love to start plugging our startups into your ecosystem. We would love to start getting them clean data they can use and start solving your problems on key initiatives and problems you have, whether it's homelessness, whether it's resiliency, whether it's emergency preparedness, it goes on. We can really start to attack these problems if we have buy-in from stakeholders and liquid data.
So I want to follow up on that point of data liquidity. So, we have folks here who've been involved in that and are doing that in their cities. Is there anything cities are not currently doing that they should be doing to get to create that liquidity? Like if you had to give them a piece of advice?
I think it's not that cities don't want to do this, right? Even if you have CIO level, and I don't, they could probably test this, maybe they can't, I don't know. But even if you have like CIO level, like agency level, hey, we want to do this is a key thing for us. It's not as simple as just signing some paperwork and all of a sudden this data is liquid. It really comes down to how do you do that? How do you start, there's a software piece in there where you have to start hiring somebody to do that. And I'm sure I could give you some names, but you have to work with someone to do that.
Okay, I want to jump off that to actually go back to Mayor Garcia and ask you a question. Because it seems like one of the recurring themes that Rohit hit on, that Stephen and Steve and Lilian as well, is that one of the key things that has to change is around culture inside our cities. And if we look at, people don't often necessarily equate government with innovation. And also look at how do we change the culture inside cities to make all of the things that all of our panelists have been talking about possible. Can you talk a little bit about just, what have you found in Long Beach, and would you have recommendations for other cities about things that they can do to help change that internal culture?
I think first you have to talk about it a lot, and so I talk about it all the time, and I think that having kind of strong leadership, both at the top as well as within the departments, is really important. And I think Mayor Garcetti is a good example of that. So I think you've got to talk about it constantly, and then you've got to set up your systems, your departments, that in a way that invites innovation, which is why we kind of restructure our whole technology department. And cities used to not have chief data officers and chief innovation officers, and this is a newer phenomenon and trend. And so I think establishing these positions and challenging folks, and then bringing in partners that can explain what kind of innovation means for cities that are not part of your structure. So in our case, bringing in Bloomberg, we brought in Code for America, which is obviously, if you don't know about those guys, they do a great job of coming into cities and doing projects. City Mart, which we talked a little bit about. Just bringing in validators from the outside that can really do small projects. We do a lot of kind of mini projects to kind of within departments to kind of show them how innovation can work. And one example is with City Mart, which is this great organization that is doing projects in a bunch of cities. We looked at procurement, for example. Procurement is like the most uninnovative thing out there. It's basically someone is spending an enormous amount of money buying a street lamp or putting out a RFP for whatever it is that you need. And what City Lab came in and worked with our public works folks is they said, look, why don't you try some mini RFPs around, instead of just buying something you think you need, put out an RFP about how you solve the problem. So instead of putting out an RFP that you need a new traffic signal on this four-way stop, put out the RFP on how you can better solve traffic at the four-way stop. And don't put yourself in a traditional closed-off worldview of how it's best that we always have to put a traffic light there, or the best way to improve science is just to do it all the way we've always done it. And so these little mini kind of RFPs we've been doing that have been involved in the community, I think have been very helpful for us. And then honestly bringing in innovative people. There's like some people in this audience that from Long Beach, people with a lot of energy. I see John back there. I mean, Sarah was with us for a while, and others that are just a lot of energy and ideas that are changing, I think, the culture of the city.
I want to follow up also on a question that Rohit brought up. As one of the things he said is there are a lot of innovators out there, whether they're at USC or Cal State Long Beach or somewhere else, that actually would be able to help solve some of these problems if you could make it easy for them to interface with government. So any recommendations on how you get like the entrepreneurs, not necessarily large companies like AECOM, but entrepreneurs that may not have the wherewithal to cut through to apply for RFPs or things like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, if anyone knows the answer to that, I'd love, help me out. I mean,
Tough question.
I think that the issue with cities is always capacity and budget, and it's great. We want to always invite folks to come in, but sometimes departments they wake up every morning and they're just trying to figure out how to provide the service that day. So it's pushing and forcing. It's bringing in what's been helpful for us is bringing in a lot of fellows and innovators from the universities, whether it's SC or UCLA or wherever, to kind of activate and push. Fuse fellows, Code for America fellows. These are things that we weren't doing a few years ago, and oftentimes I think city department heads will fight you on, well, we don't have time to kind of manage a new person, but almost always that those folks make the departments better.
Very interesting. So, Stephen, I want to ask you the flip side of the question I just asked Mayor Garcia, which basically is, I mean, AECOM is a company that partners with government on infrastructure and other projects a lot. Can you talk a little bit about the role, like what role would the private sector have in pushing the public sector to innovate?
Well, what's been really fascinating for us in our city's work is that I think Mayor Garcia just said the phrase, problem solving. I think that is a good way to, that we've been partnering with cities. So it's not, a lot of our work is traditionally driven, traditional linear process, responding to typical proposal-oriented work. But what's even more interesting, like this idea of problem solving, so for instance, currently we're working with Boston on an innovation corridor. It's an area that, Boston's a poster child for, innovation economy, but they found one of their traditionally sort of underperforming neighborhoods wasn't really being involved in that. So they started digging into the question. And one of the things we saw was that this is an area that was up for a lot of street works, so a lot of underground infrastructure improvement. And so rather than approaching it just as a traditional street corridor, we thought about this corridor as a economic development program. So asking how could we create economic development for this whole quadrant, and then having a flow through on that with the different departments about coordinating timelines and investments, coalescing budgets. I think the other thing is that our role often is that it's funny, we're connected to different parts of the city, and I think about my job at AECOM is both an inside and an outside job, because we grow up as dozens of different companies, and we have these sort of strong relationships with different departments doing specific assignments. But what's amazing is internally we see the inefficiencies because, the water team is working in that area and our urban design team is thinking about real estate strategies on that area. Are those clients talking together? And what's amazing is sometimes you just step back from it and actually, ironically, create some dialogue between different public agencies. That's something we just did with an LA River framework plan that we just launched. We met with Mayor Garcetti about a year ago, and he said, the last thing I need is another master plan. What I really need some help with is how can we get some momentum going at the river? And our role was to actually contribute a composite plan where we basically went out and talked with all the amazing smart work that was being done at the community level or at agency level, or some very visionary plans for the entire corridor. But we identified the area where there was the biggest amount of public land, and it was just amazing because nobody really put all the pieces together. And so that's something that we've been focusing a lot on is just talking about it's not just one authority that's going to do this, not one company is going to make this happen. And in fact, we partner a lot with small innovation companies on every project as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to throw that question actually back to Rohit for a moment, because we talked with Stephen about something about what larger companies are doing to basically work with government to help them be more innovative. If you had to focus on where are the best opportunities right now for sort of more entrepreneurial companies, startups, to partner with government, or where you might be looking to invest, where would they be?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Hopefully none of your competition is in the audience
Yeah.
right now, right?
We look to invest where there's a legacy industry, right? And there's just barriers to entry. So we're almost on the flip side of you have a problem and we kind of like that, whereas you have a problem and you want to solve it. So for us, like healthcare has been great. Healthcare, there's just so many barriers to entry with EMRs and electronic health records. We've done a fair amount there. Or it comes up in the most random places. I never would have imagined even taking a meeting with the smart water meter software company. It sounds so out there, But it's for us, it's always the founders. We meet people with great ideas all over the place, from smarter construction ideas or like hardware stuff like that, or software, and it's really for us. It's the people. If they have an idea, we want to support it, and we do have our key initiative in terms of legacy, but it's the founders first.
Okay, great. Steve, I want to bring you in on the conversation as well, because I know one of the things we were talking about a little bit before we came up here was, the reason why government and the private sector have to work together on this is government really is never going to be able to operate at the pace that technology is changing today. Mm-hmm. So if you were advising a city right now, like what should they do to help keep up at that pace? Who should they be working with?
Well, the number one thing they should do is, acknowledge they don't know what the future is going to look like, right? I think 5 or 10 years ago, we didn't know where we'd be today, and I would argue we also don't know that, for the next 5 or 10 years, right? And a lot of, Steve, in your world, and Mayor Garcia, yours, right? You're putting long life assets on the ground. I was in a conversation this morning with on a lighting topic, right? And it was basically around, expected useful life and how much have we depreciated and what's the write-off if we actually go to the next generation. There's some great work out of Cal Berkeley that talks about when you put a benefit case forward for something that you're going to put LED street lighting, or you're going to go to high efficiency street lights and you change all the bulbs, and over the course of 9 years you're going to make your money back, blah, 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 blah. Turns out you actually retrofitted them for LEDs at year 4, right? And that story happens over and over and over again on these types of things, that you never actually get the business case that you think you're going to get on these things, because the technology cycle, it's not just moving faster than any of our ability to kind of predict the future. It's moving faster than what we built into our financial models and our capital budgets at the city level, right? And creating huge barriers, right? Which is so one of the things is thinking of the as a service model, right, is a big one where instead of buying light poles, you start buying lumens of light, and you let someone else figure out what's the right, most economic way at some point in time to provide that service. Another mindset shift that I would say is there's a mindset in a lot of cities of I've got this cost base of the infrastructure, right? I've got streets to maintain, garbage to pick up, police cars to operate, blah, blah, blah. And there's a little bit of a mindset around, flipping that and thinking, you've got an asset network, right? And how are you actually monetizing that asset network to offset its operating cost is, a little bit of a different flip of that. 5G is probably the, best example of that, right? Where you're moving from, and I, by the way, I know this much about 5G, but I do know that it's not, big tower sites in a handful of places. It's a highly distributed, thing. And from a city perspective, you're now saying, wow, when I put those parking meters in, I never envisioned that I could actually sell the top of that parking meter to Verizon or Comcast or whoever.
Right.
And now you can, right? And I think that's the world where we're moving toward, where there's an opportunity on the city level to start thinking of monetization of the cities. And I don't mean Hammond, Indiana, or wherever, selling the Chicago Skyway to, I mean actually like, generating rents from the asset network that you have versus
Right.
just thinking of, taxes and spending the money on costs.
Right. And I think with that, one of the things I've noticed, in whether it's Long Beach or a number of other places, is that oftentimes the first problem is you don't often have a line item in your budget to do some of this new work, which is why I think philanthropy ends up playing a really big role in coming in at the beginning, whether it was Bloomberg that came in with Long Beach at the beginning, or the Knight Foundation, which I think this is an area you're very focused on. Can you talk a little bit right now, Lilian, about what do you see the role both of your foundation and of foundations generally in seeding new projects? And if you could, are there any interesting projects we should have our eyes on that you're funding?
Yeah. So at the Knight Foundation, our founders come out of the newspaper business. So the core mission is really to support an informed and engaged society. And we do that by making investments in innovation in journalism and arts and in the communities in which the Knight newspaper corporation worked in. So what I'm doing now at Knight is really focusing on how do we think about the impact of technology in cities, and how do we create a smart cities investment strategy that really supports an informed and engaged society. A lot of technology that is being developed is really being developed, if you will, at consumers. And so how do we kind of flip the script to some degree, right? And then get more of that consumer citizen-centric design into some of the technologies that are being built and pushed out into the public space. And I think the role of philanthropy is really interesting in this particular space, because it's obviously, the traditional role of convening and bringing collaborations to life, of thinking of new ways of doing things is still relevant. But I think the one that I'm most excited about is we just want to put people to work. I think a lot of the common themes that you're hearing of examples is just people just getting at it and doing work. So in Long Beach, we funded the City Mart initiative around procurement, and I love the example Mayor Garcia mentioned about just doing small mini RFPs. If we want to see change, let's just start doing it. Let's stop talking about it, let's just do it. And so one of the things we really think about at Knight is how are we catalysts? We actually call ourselves social investors as opposed to grant makers. And we really think about how do we catalyze just a slightly different way of working so that we can just get going. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that's happening, and I guess what I will say is we're going to start to fund more in this space, so you'll hear more about it. But even just in our existing portfolio, we're thinking about how technology, for example, impacts what we call the civic commons. So we're going to reimagine public space. What does public space look like in 5 to 10 years? And what does it look like when you don't have those towers, when you have small cell, and when you and I are moving along that road or along those parks and have our data transmitted to those cells, and applications are pushing data back into us. We're trying to reimagine what that public space and what that movement and interaction looks like. And how do we do it in such a way where it doesn't disconnect us, right? Where it creates more of the connection that we're all missing, that we think technology is sort of ruining. And how do we how do we actually fund that kind of work? So we're spending a lot of time thinking about how tech in the commons, for example, in Philadelphia, is emerging. We're also thinking about how civic institutions like libraries and museums get out of that kind of internal space and come out into the public space. So what does the library of the future look like if physical books aren't the thing that's going to be on the shelf? What is the space in that library? How do is it much more of round tables and us sitting around with iPads or audio books or things like that? I'm being very, very basic here, but really reimagining what a library looks like in the future is one of those key spaces. Museums, do we have to go into the museum to get art, or does this kind of technology shift actually make art more accessible to everybody, where it hasn't actually been accessible equitably in our history, right? And then the other thing that we're trying to do is really focus on investments that are about shifting the way in which collaborations between, hopefully, we're talking about this now as we're developing our strategy around this, but thinking about how government, public and private partners come together. So how can, for example, Knight, through our partnership with Niantic, who is the creator of Pokemon Go, influence Niantic to think about Pokemon not just as a strategy to get people to find, the Pokepops. I don't actually use the tool, but like how do we place Pokestops in front of libraries or city halls? How do we and have them actually think about that civic component into their space? This is an opportunity for philanthropy to kind of be a little bit of that bridge of bringing that civic perspective into technology that we all kind of know is sort of missing, but we're not quite sure how to fill. I'll stop there and hopefully that gives you ideas.
Well, I have about 10 more questions I would like to ask, but I would actually like to throw it out to the audience to open it up to some questions from folks out there, and I will follow up if nobody else does. But questions from the audience? Right here in the front. And if you could tell us who the question is directed at, and I think we have a mic coming.
It's Lilian, but it's Lilian, but anybody else who wants to jump in. You talked about the 20 to 30,000 employees in the LA County, and in Steve Ballmer's thing, he talked about doing the skip level. How are you leveraging the knowledge that the people who are doing the jobs can bring forward and get their innovation from those levels?
So I'll use our Clean Streets example. We use it a lot, but the reason why I'll do it is because I feel like it's a soup to nuts example of how you can actually get data integrated into like a full like organizational culture. So with the Clean Streets initiative, it was a data-driven process that really was actually heralded by the mayor, who said we want to make sure LA's streets are clean, that they're equitable, and we want it to be data-driven and innovative. So Department of Sanitation, with a lot of leadership from across the city, came up with a strategy to grade every street, come up with this index. The thing that I think that's really powerful about the example is that it wasn't just that at the leadership level we said we're going to do this, and then we got some team together, really smart people, and figured out where the data was and crunched some numbers and said go out and deploy resources. What we've done is we've actually involved the trash collector. They are part of the teams who go out there and grade the street. They help to give it a score. That score then is sent up to a middle team who's actually now aggregating it and doing quality assurance on images that are taken of the street to make sure that someone's not saying it's clean when it's not. That then is taken up at the management chain and thought about in terms of like the grids across the city and how do we divide our department into 9 districts and how do we redeploy resources and why does this part of this district consistently stay red and not others. That is then used to talk to community members and community and city council members about what's going on in that area that we can know about. Perhaps there's a lot of, let's say, construction businesses and they're dumping under that freeway underpass. The level, like integrating it into the full business process from soup to nuts is what actually creates a transformation from within the organization. Our trash collectors, I like to call them the smartest trash collectors in America, they're doing this with their devices. They're not data scientists, and they don't have to be. Like, that's not the point. But they can be a part of the process if we actually think about designing solutions that span the whole gamut of the service delivery. And I think that that's really critical. And you can do that very simply and elegantly. I mean, I think this process started in September and was rolled out in April. So this is not like, and it's not revolutionary. We didn't kind of redesign trash collection in any way, but what we did is we engaged all aspects of the organization in the process. And I think that that's the designing and thinking of services in that way. The more and more we do that, I think the more and more we're actually going to see a lot of this transformation and involvement from across the organization.
Another question. We'll go here and then here. So the woman right here.
To Lilian, where do I go as a citizen, a private citizen, to find the maps that show which streets are clean, particularly mine?
Yeah. So if you go to Clean Streets, I believe it's Clean Streets LA.
Okay.
Yeah, it's Clean Streets LA, and and yeah, I'm forgetting the URL at this moment, but it's the Clean Streets and Clean Stat program is another way to Google it. But if you search that in Los Angeles, you will find it. You'll find the map, and you will be able to enter your street. And we update it quarterly. And actually, the LA Times uses that data. LA Times uses that data to hold the city accountable. So there's this whole other accountability layer on top of it that's really great.
Thank you.
Great. We had this gentleman here, and then we'll come to Nick in front.
So my question was about using data and transparency and technology to build the civic trust. I'm an elected, and it's neat because I'm an engineer and I love kind of what you're doing in terms of engineering and city services, but there is a real gap, and I think a growing gap, around the electorate's trust of government, and I think it's probably at a peak. Any thoughts about the way we can use technology to kind of illuminate, and I think government's not perfect, but I think it's a lot better than maybe the cynics would like it to be. But it's a lack of transparency and understanding, and I mean, reading minutes and going through PDFs really doesn't engage people in the way government works. So I'm wondering whether there's any creative solutions around engaging the electorate into the government process so they feel like they're more involved, and frankly, that will then help with civic innovation. So that's an easy question.
I have two thoughts. I'll be quick because one's a longer-term program of engagement, and one's a short-term win. The largest public infrastructure project in the U.S. right now is San Francisco's replacing all of its storm sewers. And part of the, smartly, what the SFPUC required was a triple bottom line to allow the not only the agencies to evaluate the different alternatives that were being considered for this multi-billion-dollar program, but more importantly, in my opinion, and actually as it's been rolled out, it's provided this incredible engagement tool where you could actually engage with the community about performance metrics of the different alternatives, so that actually the citizens were able to weigh in on the costs and benefits of each program, and actually talk about what their priorities were, because I think it's important to have a transparent discussion about, we can't afford everything, so what would your priorities be? So that's a long-term program engagement tool that I think is a way, sort of a sign of what's coming in the future. And then I'll talk about, short-term wins are really important in this. The flooding program that I talked about, all the work that Chicago's doing, one really amazing outcome that happened very quickly was, as we talked about this long-term grant application to the federal government a couple years ago, it was at the same time the Parks Department was closing a beach in Humboldt Park, which is adjacent to some of the most challenged neighborhoods in western Chicago. And it was just by having the Parks Department and the Sewer Department in the same room, they realized that it was a shortfall of $1 million in a budget that closed this really important park in a neighborhood that really needed that during the summers. And in 2016, they were able to reopen it. So 2 years after the initial part of this discussion, which is a really short period of time, they were able to actually identify that the sewer department had a excess water problem. The park department they couldn't afford clean water. So for a relatively modest expenditure, they were able to quickly enhance a lagoon that the water is treated naturally, and the beach reopened. And to me, that's now the city's getting smarter about telling that story, and you win people over that way.
Mm-hmm. Let me add to that too. I think there's a lot of innovation happening in cities, but I find that the one that inspires the most trust, and the one that I'm still surprised that more cities aren't doing because it's so basic, is just the basic kind of public works smartphone app that a lot of the bigger cities at least have. And we get now more requests to clean up graffiti and broken curbs through the app, through the Go Long Beach app, than by phone calls or emails or any other form at the city. And what's great about it is it keeps everybody accountable as a user. And so I can go, I take a picture of the graffiti, it's geotagged, it immediately goes to the city, and then you get a response from the city saying the graffiti's been removed. And now you as a user, really, you know that your government has responded to you, and it's trackable, and of course, then you can use the data for a bunch of other interesting things. But I just think that technology is transparent, and it gives users the ability to track their requests versus just making a phone call in and hoping that someone calls you back. And so I think I'm always so surprised that it only seems to be larger cities that are still using kind of these smartphone apps to provide service, or at least to track service.
I think we have maybe time for one more question. Is that right? Here, if we have two, I'll come right over.
Great, thank you. And it's kind of a follow-up. I mean, my question is about what I've seen in large government bureaucracies and civic institutions, and we'll speak specifically about the Los Angeles Unified School District, is that one of the barriers to doing this isn't actually the unwillingness to be transparent or use data. It's the thought that they already are. Right, that's even more insidious. So we are being transparent because our budget is a 300-page PDF Excel spreadsheet that's online.
Yeah.
And so I guess for Mayor Garcia or Lilian, and maybe it's a software question too, but that next, how do you go, and is it about just the words you're using, which is usability and user friendliness, or are there, how do you go about the software process to take what is yes, it's transparent if your data in a spreadsheet is online, but that's not doing any good to the institution or to the public.
Yeah. If I could just, I think that there's nothing more important right now in government than to think about getting a UX designer on your team, and it's something fairly simple. There's a reason why people trust businesses more than government, and it's not just because of all the media piece. It's because when you try to engage with government, you can't really get an answer. And it's not necessarily because there's a transparency issue, it's just because you really can't get an answer. Because there is no easy way to navigate all of our systems. And I think every big city still struggles with this. So there's nothing as simple as really thinking about the user experience when they go on their websites. I mean, Amazon invests millions and millions of dollars to do that, and it benefits them. And it benefits them in revenue, and that makes sense for them. For us in government, it doesn't seem to make sense to kind of invest in making it easier for people to do government, because either it's sort of an incentive, there's this fear that it's an incentive to ask for more services, or there's this fear of I don't know what. But the reality is, if we actually just made those simple kind of design choices on websites, made sure that no budget should be released in PDF anymore. Like, come on, who's really going to know what's happening in their city if they have to read it 300 pages? Like, we know this intuitively, but we're not making the small investments in making sure that it's truly accessible. And the fear is really unreasonable, and the reward is actually going to be a huge increase in trust in your institution if people can actually engage with you on it. I think it's a simple, really low-hanging fruit.
Does the city of LA have UX designers?
So we actually do. So in the data team, we had a design fellow, and then on our innovation team, we had a design fellow. And we did a couple of big things. We also did a business portal that our innovation team, funded by Bloomberg, led. And then my team led a procurement systems reform process that really was about redesigning the entry website into the procurement process in LA. We were not able to completely reform the process because procurement is one of the most entrenched issues in any city. But what we could do is we could make it easier, so when you got on the website, you at least were able to find out what the opportunities were in bid, right? Like, that's a low-hanging fruit that should not stop you as a city or anybody from doing business with you. So yeah, we do, and we probably need even more of it across the city as well.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question.
I'm excited about all I'm hearing with big cities, big data. My question is, how do we serve the underserved communities, and where do you get the data that's going to do all this smart and save lives and money? So I'm really curious as to what kinds of things are being put in place to make sure that there is inclusion in all of the changes that you're making that really relate back to those people that I have not heard spoken about
So
today.
great question, because we've heard about things like sanitation. We've heard about things like basically supply chain issues. What about issues like foster care, public health, probation, other things that affect people that typically don't get access to these services?
Well, I'll just briefly, how are you doing? Good to see you. Go Long Beach, that's right. Got some Long Beach peeps up here. So I just say that I think I would hope that any project that we do that is around innovation or technology is done through an equity lens, and that we are thinking that all users, particularly those that are in low-income communities and might have a bigger digital divide and access to technology, that we're thinking about that and putting more efforts in that area. I mean, whether it's on the crime issue or whether it's on the public works issue. The bigger challenge, I think, for cities is ensuring that we're not moving so fast that we are leaving folks that don't have access to technology behind, and that's something that we have to always put ourselves in check on, because oftentimes it's great to have everything on the smartphone and to have super fast Wi-Fi, but when 10% of your city doesn't have access to any sort of computer, with the exception of ones that are in the library, then it becomes problematic. And so the more we put online, the less folks are answering the phone, and that doesn't serve seniors or low-income people. And so that's something that's, I think, a challenge, and there's no easy solution. But we're always trying to ensure that we're not moving so fast that we lose the traditional way of service that particularly seniors and low-income folks rely on that don't have access to technology.
I'll just say that something that's really fascinating that happened this past couple months is the Amazon HQ2 bid process, where a private sector came in and completely turned the tables on the entire process of how a company is looking to grow. And their emphasis on human capital, to me, was the reason why I bring that up to answer your question, is that I think cities that are going to compete well into the future are going to turn the conversation around from areas of concern or communities of concern to actually be smart about leveraging their human capital fully. Because I think that's, in a post-global world, I think cities are going to have to start figuring out how to attract investment, and having human capital fully engaged is going to make the difference between succeeding and not.
And I'll just add, because there's one group that hasn't been mentioned in this conversation, and that's the nonprofit sector. If we think government has fallen behind in innovation, our nonprofits oftentimes don't even have access to a lot of just basic technologies. So they're really critical. My career actually started in the technology, in the nonprofit sector, and looking at how they were using technology. And one of the things that we've been doing with LA with the community partners, and it's a great reminder, is actually thinking about how we partner with the Cal State University system to equip nonprofits to actually work with community members to access the data and use the data in their own community engagement and advocacy. There needs to be a connection between academia, nonprofits, and government in engaging that work and supporting citizens' own utility in this process.
Great. So with that, I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank our panelists, and also thank the Milken Institute for the opportunity to be here. So thank you all for coming.